Today's lecture is about two important events that shaped the history of the USA. The first one is the famous speech by Martin Luther King Jr., which defined the role of the black people in America, and the second is the attack on the USA by the Taliban on 11 September 2001. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. He became an important leader for the blacks in their struggle for equality. In 1963, he delivered his speech famously known as "I Have a Dream" to over 250,000 people in Washington. Did you know that the speech itself didn't have an official title? But because he repeats this sentence in his speech, we come to call it "I Have a Dream." He was shot on the 4th of April 1968 and died on the spot. His assassination led to a wave of riots in many cities in the US. According to research and evidence found, the person who shot King was James Earl Ray. Ray confessed to killing King, but retracted that confession 3 days later. In court, he pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty. Instead, he got a 99-year prison sentence. He died in 1998 after having served 30 years of his sentence. We discussed it a little bit in a previous lecture, but in the time between 1930 and 1970, blacks were a minority in the USA and they were treated badly. This was because of segregation. The whites thought of themselves as better and did not want to get infected by black people who were still seen as slaves, even though slavery was abolished almost 100 years before that in 1865. Laws were introduced, which were called the Jim Crow laws. Blacks had to go to black schools, had to attend black churches, weren't welcome in some shops, and had to go to different toilets than the whites. We know these laws better as the Black Code. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the first pioneers who really got through to people and got the racial problems on the political agenda. Martin Luther King was inspired by Mahatma Gandhi. He used a new way of fighting the whites by not fighting them at all. This was called the nonviolent resistance. It meant that peaceful protests were held and blacks were not to go into provocations made by the whites, so the whites couldn't do anything. Being better than the violent white people made the whites even more angry, but it also inspired respect from other corners of the country. In the movie Selma, you can see how terribly bad the whites behaved and how the nonviolent resistance was effective. It was this march, which was broadcast on live television, that showed how badly the whites dealt with the nonviolent way of protesting by King's movement. Martin Luther King Jr. is best known for the speech he gave on 28 August 1963 in Washington. The speech was 17 minutes long, and, standing in front of the big white statue of Abraham Lincoln, King delivered his speech to over 250,000 people who attended the March on Washington. This march was held 2 years before the march in Selma went horribly wrong. In his speech, King often used the phrase, "I have a dream," followed by his view on society in coming years. This speech helped the leaders of the country to put civil rights at the top of the political agenda, and in the years to come, desegregation, as it was called, helped black people get the same rights as white people. Another big event that shaped the USA as it is today were the terrorist attacks on New York and Washington on 11 September 2001. Known throughout the world as 9/11, these attacks killed over 3,000 people and have caused major changes to the way America fights wars and sees the world. Because the Americans use a different system than the Europeans, sometimes people think 9/11 is 9 November. On the morning of 11 September 2001, 4 airplanes were hijacked. 2 airplanes hit the 2 largest towers of the World Trade Center. In contrast to what people believe, the World Trade Center consists of more than one building. In the attack, only the two largest towers, over 100 floors each, were hit, while 4 other buildings were so badly damaged they had to be demolished. Another plane hit the Pentagon an hour after the first hits, and a 4th airplane, heading for Washington, perhaps to the Capitol or the White House, was reclaimed by the passengers and crashed in an empty field in Pennsylvania. The attack killed 2,977 people, most of which were inside the WTC at the moment of impact. To save themselves from suffocation or being burned alive, over 200 people jumped out of the towers. A photograph taken of one of these people has become famous under the name The Falling Man. Let's talk specifics. The first plane hit the North Tower at 8:46 a.m. The second plane hit the South Tower at 9:03 a.m. At 9:58, the South Tower was the first tower to come down, followed by the North Tower at 10:28 a.m. You can find a lot of footage where you can see the two planes actually hitting the towers, a shocking view for many people when it first happened. The Pentagon was hit by the third plane at 9:37 a.m., almost an hour after the first plane hit WTC-1. Later that morning, the 4th plane crashes in the Pennsylvania field. Al-Qaeda claimed responsibility for the attacks in 2001. Its leader, Osama bin Laden, said that the reasons for the attacks were the USA's support of Israel, the presence of US troops in Saudi Arabia, and the sanctions against Iraq because of their mass destruction weaponry. After a 7-year war, Osama bin Laden was killed on 2 May 2011. Osama bin Laden did not get buried on land, but at sea. This way, people cannot worship his grave. However, this act made it possible for people to question bin Laden's death, because no one ever saw his body. Bin Laden being killed did not end the war in Iraq though, because the last American troops left Iraq in December of 2011. As with all terrible events, there are people who do not believe these events happened the way we think they did. These people have created so-called conspiracy theories. The most common theory is that the collapse of the Twin Towers was not the result of the planes hitting the towers, but rather controlled demolitions by the government. They also think that the US allowed a plane to hit the Pentagon. The reason why these theories exist is because people think this was the best way for the government to start a war in Iraq and Afghanistan. The theories even go so far as to say that there were no planes that hit the towers, but that these were photoshopped into pictures by the US government. After intensive research, it was concluded that there was no truth in these conspiracy theories. Every person is free to have their own opinion about the event. However, you have to be careful to voice an opinion that differs from the story as it stands. By denying this happened or accusing other groups for being part in 9/11, you hurt many people's feelings, but you also make yourself a target. So, what do these two events mean for present-day America? It might give you a little more insight on the racial problems in the USA today. You now know how sensitive the situation is and why Americans feel so strongly about racial equality. And now you also know why you have to be at an airport 3 hours before your flight leaves, and why the USA is so tough on foreign countries like Iraq and Afghanistan. Especially with ISIS, you might understand why the USA is the front runner when it comes to fighting this extremist group.